Hi everyone, and welcome to my second of two videos on the Olympus OM10. In the first video we looked at the camera as a whole and we went over its buttons and dials and just took a look at that. But in this video we're going to take a look at actually how to use some of those things. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to mount and dismount a lens. So I've got a lens right here. And it's a bayonet mount system. So you take the red dot on the lens, line it up with the red dot on the bayonet, turn it, set about a third of a turn, quarter of a turn, whatever it is, and then you can feel it lock into place. And now it's not going to come off the camera without the release button being pressed. To unmount it, press the release button, turn, and unmount. And now the camera's been, and that's how that works. Another thing is that most, if not all, of the OM cameras, the camera lenses rather, have a depth of field preview built into them. So this button down here, you can hear it's triggering the aperture, is controlling the depth of field preview. So what we'll do, you can see through there. That's what's happening with the stop down. With the depth of field preview / stop down metering button built into the lenses. Next, we're going to load some film here so you can see how the film loading works. And now remember, what I'm about to demonstrate, you can load your film in subdued daylight, ideally. I would not really recommend doing it in bright film in bright light rather, but subdued light is fine. So now I'm going to hit the shutter release, and I'm not going to advance it yet. I'm going to pull the leader out a little bit. Feed the leader into the take-up spool, advance, do it again, and now I'm ready to shut the film back. Now I'll take a look here. Let's refocus on that real quickly. You can see each time I advance the lever, oops, there we go, the counter advances one number. So I'm going to advance 3. And now I'm on a live frame. I'm ready to start taking actual pictures. So I'm going to show you what that looks like inside. Now, if this were real, if this film weren't already destroyed, once you load film in your camera, don't open the back, because you'll wipe out every picture on the camera that you've already taken. They will be ruined. So once the film's loaded, it's in there. You don't want to mess with it. So I'm going to tighten this up a little bit. I'm going to leave this out so you can see it. What happens here? When I take a picture, after the shot, when I'm advancing, you can see how that rotates as the film's being taken up. So after you load the film, you want to tighten this a little bit and then watch this as you're advancing to your first frame to make sure it's turning. And if it is, then you know everything's being done correctly. So now inside the camera, you can see here how the film is lined up between these two guide rails to keep it vertically in position. And that prevents the image from accidentally getting onto the registration holes right here or into the margins where they have film data printed onto the film on the other side of the registration holes. The film back over here, the film back, when this is closed, provides pressure right in here, also between these rails. So it goes up to these rails, and it keeps this film flat up on plane, and ensures that the film is in the right position to take sharp photos. And you can see then that after I activate the shutter and I advance the film take-up spool moves, and then this sprocket keeps tension on the film as it goes forward. Now once I'm done with the film, and bearing in mind again that all of the picture taking has to be done with the film back closed. I set this over to rewind. I turned the rewind knob 90 degrees, so it's ready to rewind. So now I'm going to start doing that. And you'll be able to see what happens inside the camera during the rewind operation. This actually stays in place, like that. And you can see as you're rewinding it, now when it gets to this point, you'll hear that sound outside the camera, so you know you're almost done. And you'll feel a little bit of an increase in tension followed by a sudden drop in tension. And now you know that the film is on its way back to the cassette. When you use an actual cassette to take pictures, you want to rewind your film all the way into the cassette to prevent yourself from accidentally using the same cassette more than once and getting an entire roll of double exposures. So I mentioned before that my battery is basically dead. Well, I have tons of spares, I just don't happen to have them over here in the studio. Studio is code for white sheet that I put over the kitchen counter above the dishwasher. But I'm going to open up the battery chamber rather, with a quarter, and any coin that fits will work. If you're not in the US, then there are definitely foreign coins that have the proper diameter, or proper width rather. And you can see there are these two little button cell batteries. Now when you put them in, you'll have to take them out, but you want to wipe them off in your shirt or something like that to get your fingerprints off of them, because fingerprints can actually cause the surface to be etched and can degrade its ability to transmit the current. So the inside of the film chamber here is marked with plus, which means that when you close the film chamber, the plus side, which is the smooth side, there's a a side that has a ring on the outside of it here, and then a smooth side. The smooth side is what you want to have facing the battery chamber like that, or the battery cover like that. And so I just pulled these off camera to wipe my fingerprints off of them. When you load them, that's what it should look like, with the plus side being visible that way. And so it takes two of these. You can get them at the grocery or store or pharmacy, usually for about $2 to $4 a piece, depending on make. I actually bought 100 of them, off-brand ones, online for $2, including shipping. So I have these things for life. And yeah, they were all like, ranged between being 10% used and 50% used, but it's still substantially cheaper. And yeah, I've gone through half of them in a year, but still, it's been cheaper than buying a whole bunch of new ones. So you can find good deals on these batteries online, and LR44 batteries are still made readily, so it's pretty easy to find replacements for the OM10 still. Up here you've got the flash Hotshoe with X-Sync, and what that means is it can only take electronic flashes. And now that's fine because all modern flashes are electronic flashes. And the older flash type were FP flashes and M flashes and a couple of different bulb types, but those are obsolete, and I don't think bulbs are even made anymore for them. So any flash you use today, especially if you just go buy one right now, even if it's a $10 flash that you buy from some standard big box retailer, is going to be an electronic flash and will work on this Hotshoe. The only contact needed is the center one. If you buy a flash that only has the center contact, it will work just fine. If you buy one that has a secondary contact or multiple contacts, and it gives a little bit of information back to the camera, but the camera will work just fine without a multiple contact flash. It will just assume that the battery is always full and the flash is always ready to shoot. For 99.9% of uses, a really basic flash will be fine. And now if you get into high-end flash or strobe photography and things like that, then you're going to need a slightly different setup, and this camera probably isn't going to carry that weight anyway. But for most uses that this camera is suitable for, a standard single contact flash is fine. It has a flash sync speed of 1/60th of a second, meaning that you can take a flash. The fastest shutter speed you can use when using a flash is 1/60th of a second. And the reason for that is let's say that what you're seeing right now represents the space that the shutter can open. So you have a cloth shutter covering your film. So when you take a picture, that cloth shutter is going to open, and at 1/60th of a second, it's the fastest shutter speed where the entire film is exposed to light for an instantaneous fraction of a second before the second curtain comes and shuts behind it, and then everything is covered again from the light. At 1/125th of a second, this is just for demonstration, it might look something about like this. At 1/1000th of a second, it might look something about like that. And so what's happening is that the shutter isn't opening and closing faster, but the gap between the leading and the trailing curtain gets bigger or smaller depending on the shutter speed. So if it's 1/30th of a second, it'll open up all the way and it'll be exposed for a slightly longer time than at a 60th. And likewise, if it's a full second, it'll open up all the way, hang out there for a full second, and then close. So at 1/60th and slower speeds, you can use the flash just fine. If you take a flash photo at 1/125th, part of your image might be blacked out. At 1/500th, maybe everything but a little tiny bit of it would be blacked out. Same thing at 1/1000th. So if you're going to use flash photography, don't do anything faster than 1/60th of a second. Next thing we're going to look at is how to use the exposure compensation dial and what exactly it's doing to the camera when it's used. So I switched lenses. I switched over to my macro lens, and that's because after we look at this, we're going to look through the viewfinder to see what the meter looks like and the focusing screen. So here is the exposure compensation dial, and you can see right now it's set at 100 ISO. So let's say that I wanted to bracket an image, and I wanted to take 3 photos. I wanted to take one that was 1 stop underexposed, 1 stop properly exposed, and 1 stop overexposed. Now, you might be familiar with this technique in digital photography for HDR photos. And you can do HDR photos in film if you scan the negatives using the same technique. The other thing that bracketing is really useful for is if you have complex lighting situations and you're not 100% certain that you've got the exposure set correctly. The bracketing allows you to try different settings to perhaps get one that is correct. And any exposure within 1/3 of a stop really is considered correct. So 1 stop either way is pretty good for bracketing. So to bracket the exposure 1 stop, I'm going to start with 1 stop underexposed. That's my style. I go under, normal, over. If you wanted to go over, normal, under, or under, over, normal, whatever pattern works for you is fine, just as long as you do it consistently. I always go darker to lighter. So, at least on film cameras I do. On digital cameras I actually do it the opposite way. Don't ask me why. So, at any rate, to underexpose by 1 stop, you would turn the dial until the blue 1, is lined up with your film's ISO. So, underexposed by 1 stop means moving the 1 to 100. Take a picture, properly exposed with a white line at 100. Now move the red 1, oops, almost there. Move the red 1 to next to the 100, and now you're going to overexpose by a stop. And taking 3 pictures like that, you've successfully bracketed. Now, what do I mean by over and underexposed by a stop? If you have 100 ISO film, 50 ISO film is 1 stop slower. 200 is 1 stop faster. So likewise, if you're using a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second, 1/30th is 1 stop slower. 1/125th is 1 stop faster. And your apertures, if you have an aperture of f5.6, well, f4 is 1 stop faster, and f8 is 1 stop slower. And so the term stop comes from the aperture setting, but what it's used to mean an exposure value, an exposure index or light value, the way that the light interacts on the film. And the technical details of that are outside the scope of this video. That's just to kind of give you an idea of what the term stop means and why it's used the same way for different ISO settings, different shutter settings, and different aperture settings, because it's not just a setting on the aperture setting on the camera. It's the aperture setting on, it's the way that the light interacts with the film. So this does have some limitations though. So let's say you're shooting 50 ISO film. Well, you can go 1 and 2 stops underexposed, but you can only go 1 stop overexposed. And the reason is because this will only meter down to 25 ISO, and you can't adjust this dial. You can't adjust this dial any further. Likewise, on any other film camera that doesn't have an exposure compensation dial, if you want to bracket, whoa, that's crazy. Never had that happen before. My shutter, or my camera, just started making this buzzing noise, and then the image just went crazy on it, so that's weird. That was some, I think that was some jelly effect. I think that me moving my hand away so quickly caused it to try to regain focus, and at any rate, and it was camera shake compensation in the sensor. But at any rate, so if you're using any other film camera and you don't have an exposure compensation dial, to bracket images or compensate your image, a very easy way to do it is simply to adjust the ISO setting on the camera instead of trying to compensate with different apertures and calculate it like that, especially on a lens that has multiple stops between full stops. And at any rate, that's just a really quick and easy way to do it. Next thing we have this little switch right here, which switches between B, auto, and manual adapter. So if you don't have the manual adapter, you'll either leave it in auto, so the camera automatically calculates the shutter speed, or B, and B means that if you push down the shutter, it will the shutter release, then the shutter will stay open until you release the shutter release. In manual mode, if you do not have the manual adapter, this fires the shutter at 1/60th of a second and triggers the flash. So, so if you're using your flash, you'll want to set it into manual mode to get the best results. Oh, one last thing I forgot to mention also with the exposure compensation. You can't really get the full range of exposure compensation much above 400 ISO for the same but reverse reason as when you're at the bottom end of the spectrum. But really, if you're trying to do too much exposure compensation beyond the range of 50 to 400 ISO, I mean, the films that would exist for that aren't always necessarily intended for exposure compensation. Someone's going to argue with me on that, and I apologize for offending your sensibilities, but it doesn't matter really, since by and large you can't get anything slower than 50 ISO anymore anyway. All right, let's take a look through this viewfinder. There we go. Oh boy, is that filthy. Now, where is the light meter in here? Sometimes it's easier to find these light meters than other times when I hold the camera up to the macro lens. Let's see if that helps any. Alright, so I'm having a lot of trouble finding the light meter that way. So I'm going to try it a different way. What the heck just happened there? So this is going to be in reverse. But you can see here, that's what the focusing screen looks like. And over on the left side is the light meter. That would actually be on the right side when you're looking through the camera. And you can see that well, you can't see the actual needle. Yeah, because the battery is super dead. It's the meter's not responding right now. But what you can see there, oh, it's maybe because nope, it's an auto. Yeah, it's just because the battery's dead that the light meter's not responding. But there's a needle that goes from red, which means way overexposed, down to your shutter speed based on what your aperture is. And so if you have your aperture at f8 and it says 1/125th, that's pretty good. If you change it to f11, then it would say 1/60th, or if you change it to f5.6, it would say 1/250th. And so that's how you read your aperture priority shutter. So the last note about this camera before we wrap is that the meter is a center-weighted meter. And what that means is that let's say that this is your image. I'm going to change my K7 to center-weighted metering here. Let's see if that has any effect. Ooh. It had that effect again. Oh boy, I hope my K7's not getting sick. At any rate, so what center-weighted means is that there's a central part of the image that provides the majority of the metering data. So if this is approximately what it is, where the outline where my fingers are moving, and about 60% of the meter of the shutter speed setting based on the meter, based on the light coming in through the lens, is determined by this central area. The remaining 40% would come from the outside area. And what that means is that if you have something really, really, really bright in the center, then you're going to have an exposure compensation that's going to be for that bright area. Likewise, if you have a spotlight, like from like a street lamp up here, but you have a darker subject right here, the street lamp's going to be extremely bright because the shutter is going to be the shutter setting is going to be based mostly on the light in the center, and so the street light could throw off your final image based on the way that the meter is reading it. For most uses, center-weighted metering is actually really, really good, and will provide you a pretty good final result for your image in most situations. So with that, the last thing I'd like to say is that if this video was helpful to you, give me a thumbs up. That lets me know that I'm on the right track and the content I'm producing is helping you. Also, if you'd like to know about more videos I make as they come out, you can subscribe to my channel. I'll have that be less blurry. Subscribe to my channel, and that will give you a notice when I upload a new video, which is not as regular as I would like it to be, but I try to do these when I can, and often. Also, if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, please leave those in the comments box below. I'm pretty good about responding fairly quickly, and I do read every comment and question that I get and try to respond. Also, if you have any suggestions for future videos, please leave those in the comments, and I will be more than happy if I have the technical knowledge and equipment to make that video. In fact, a number of the videos that I've been working on, and one I'm going to be uploading at the same time as this, came from a viewer suggestion. So I like those because it gives me ideas I might not have come up with otherwise. And there was one last thing I want to say before we go. Thank you guys for watching. Oh, and stick around, I'll show you some photos I took with this exact camera. Now, thank you guys for watching.